The long driveway leading to Sean Diddy Combs' sprawling Beverly Hills mansion was unusually quiet that autumn evening. The air hung thick with an odd stillness, and the golden glow of dusk cast eerie shadows on the perfectly trimmed hedges. An Amazon delivery van, its bright blue logo stark against the mansion's pristine white gates, idled at the entrance. Inside the van, Marcus, a relatively new delivery driver, stared at the address on his handheld scanner, then back at the ornate gates in front of him. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. This can't be right, he muttered to himself, but the GPS confirmed it. 944 Crescent Drive, Diddy's address. The package, a plain brown box with no distinguishing marks, seemed ordinary enough. There was no return address, which wasn't entirely uncommon, but something about it unsettled Marcus. He shrugged it off. Paranoia had no place in his line of work. Packages were just packages, after all. As the gates creaked open, Marcus drove up the winding path that led to the mansion. The place was everything you'd expect from a music mogul's residence. Grand columns, towering windows, and a perfectly manicured lawn that stretched endlessly. But what struck Marcus wasn't the grandeur, it was the silence. Not a single person was in sight. No security guards, no bustling staff, just an overwhelming emptiness that seemed to swallow the echoes of his footsteps as he approached the massive front door. He rang the doorbell, the chime reverberating through the house like the toll of a distant bell. Moments later, the door opened, but it wasn't Diddy who greeted him. A housekeeper, a petite woman with sharp eyes and an expression that seemed perpetually stern, stood in the doorway. She looked at the package, then at Marcus, her frown deepening. "This for Mr. Combs?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, holding out the package. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, her hands trembling slightly as though she could sense something was off. Without another word, she closed the door, leaving Marcus to make his way back to the van, eager to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut. Inside the mansion, the housekeeper placed the package on the kitchen island, eyeing it warily. She knew better than to pry. Working for someone like Diddy meant discretion was paramount, but there was something undeniably strange about the box. It wasn't heavy, but it felt dense, as though whatever lay inside carried a weight far greater than its size suggested. Later that night, Diddy arrived home. Fresh from a recording session, he was in high spirits, his booming laughter filling the cavernous halls. Spotting the package on the counter, he raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" he asked, his tone casual. The housekeeper shrugged. "Amazon delivery. Came earlier today." Curiosity piqued, Diddy grabbed a knife and sliced through the tape. The flaps of the box sprung open, revealing a single item wrapped in crimson velvet. Frowning, he pulled it out and unwrapped it carefully. What emerged from the fabric was a small, intricately carved wooden box, its surface adorned with symbols that looked ancient and unfamiliar. "What kind of prank is this?" Diddy muttered, turning the box over in his hands. It was then that he noticed the clasp, a delicate mechanism that seemed to beckon him to open it. Without much thought, he undid the clasp, the lid creaking as it revealed the contents within. Inside was a key. Not an ordinary key, but an ornate brass key, aged and tarnished with time. Alongside it was a piece of parchment, folded and yellowed. Diddy unfolded it, his eyes scanning the spidery handwriting. The words were cryptic, a jumble of instructions and warnings that made little sense. But one phrase stood out, written in bold, ominous letters. "Do not use unless you are ready to face the truth." "Truth about what?" he scoffed. But there was an edge to his voice now, a flicker of unease. He placed the parchment back in the box and carried it to his study, the key clutched tightly in his hand. That night, as the mansion settled into its usual quiet, Diddy couldn't shake the thought of the box. It sat on his desk, its presence almost taunting him. He tried to focus on other things, checking emails, jotting down ideas for his next project, but his gaze kept drifting back to it. Finally, unable to resist, he picked up the key. The moment he held it, a strange sensation coursed through him, a tingling that started in his fingertips and spread through his entire body. It was as if the key was alive, pulsing with an energy that defied explanation. He turned it over, examining its intricate design. Then, almost instinctively, he inserted it into the lock on the box. The room seemed to shift as the key turned. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and the temperature dropped several degrees. When the box clicked open, a dense, black fog began to seep out, curling and twisting like a living thing. Diddy stumbled back, his heart racing as the fog filled the room. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. "Sean Combs," the figure intoned, his voice echoing as though it came from the depths of a cavern. "You have unlocked what should have remained sealed." Diddy tried to speak, but his throat felt constricted, his words caught in a choke of fear. "The key," the figure continued, "is a gateway, a tether to truths buried deep within the fabric of reality. And now, you must bear the weight of what you have unleashed." Before Diddy could react, the figure raised a hand, and the room dissolved around him. He was no longer in his study, but standing in a vast, featureless expanse of white. One by one, scenes began to materialize. Snapshots of his life, moments he had buried deep in his memory. There was the young boy he had once been, standing at his mother's side at his father's funeral. There was the teenager hustling on the streets, dreaming of a better life. And then there were the moments of betrayal, the times he had stepped on others to climb higher, the faces of those he had wronged staring back at him with hollow eyes. The visions came faster and faster, a relentless assault on his psyche. He tried to close his eyes to block them out, but it was no use. The figure was there, always there, watching him with a knowing smile. "This is the truth," the figure said. "Your truth, the cost of your ambition, the price of your success. Do you see it now?" When Diddy finally awoke, he was back in his study. The box was gone, as was the key. But the room was in shambles, furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. He sat up, his head pounding, his body drenched in sweat. For a moment he thought it might have been a dream, but the memories were too vivid, too real. Over the following days, Diddy couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of his vision, and strange whispers echoed through the halls of the mansion at night. The once vibrant house now felt cold and lifeless, its grandeur a hollow shell of what it had been. The package had been a doorway, a harbinger of something far beyond his understanding. And though the box and key were gone, their presence lingered, a haunting reminder of the truths he had been forced to confront. For the rest of his days, Diddy would carry the weight of that night, the memory of what he had seen, and the knowledge that some doors are better left unopened. The days following that eerie night were anything but ordinary for Diddy. The once familiar comfort of his sprawling mansion had turned into an oppressive maze of unease. Every corner of his home seemed touched by the shadows of that mysterious encounter. Yet he wasn't the only one affected. Those who worked for him, housekeepers, assistants, and even the rotating team of security guards, began to sense the change as well. Strange occurrences became the new norm. Doors that were firmly closed would creak open on their own. Lights flickered even though the electrical systems were impeccable, and the air inside the mansion grew heavy, as though the walls themselves were burdened by something unseen. Staff whispered among themselves about hearing footsteps in empty hallways and muted voices murmuring in rooms no one had entered. A few asked to be reassigned, unable to endure the oppressive atmosphere. Diddy, ever the skeptic, dismissed their concerns at first. He had convinced himself that the strange visions were nothing more than a vivid nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress, but denial could only carry him so far. One evening, as he sat alone in his dimly lit study, flipping through old photo albums in an attempt to ground himself, the whispers began again. At first they were faint, just a low hum that he could easily attribute to his imagination. But then they grew louder, distinct words forming amidst the unintelligible murmurs. "Sean, remember!" His heart slammed against his ribs. He spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind him. But the room was empty. The air, however, felt charged, almost electric. The whispers grew louder, echoing from every corner of the room. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking despite his effort to sound authoritative. There was no answer, just a burst of cold wind that extinguished the fire in the hearth. Darkness swallowed the room, and for a moment all was silent. Then out of the shadows a single phrase emerged, whispered with chilling clarity. "You opened the door." Diddy bolted from the study, his pulse pounding in his ears. He didn't stop running until he reached the grand foyer, where the light from the massive chandelier above offered a small semblance of safety. He stood there for several minutes, catching his breath, his mind racing. He had built his empire on confidence and control, but now both were slipping through his fingers. Desperate for answers, Diddy called his longtime friend and spiritual advisor, Pastor Lee, a man known for his unshakable faith and wisdom. Within hours, Pastor Lee arrived at the mansion, carrying a worn leather Bible and a calm demeanor that seemed to radiate strength. As Diddy recounted the events of the past few days, Pastor Lee listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Diddy finished, the pastor leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "This is no ordinary trouble, Sean," Pastor Lee said finally. "What you describe sounds like a spiritual breach, an opening to realms we're not meant to access. That box, that key, they were conduits, and now something has attached itself to you." "Attached itself?" Diddy echoed, his voice tinged with both disbelief and fear. The pastor nodded. "Entities from beyond our world, spirits, energies, call them what you will. They thrive on fear, guilt, and unresolved pain. They show you the truths you'd rather forget, feeding on the chaos it creates within you." Diddy felt a lump form in his throat. "So what do I do? How do I get rid of it?" Pastor Lee stood and began pacing the room. "First, we need to cleanse this house. Whatever entered here has tainted it. But more importantly, Sean, you need to confront whatever it is that's holding power over you. These entities latch onto cracks in our souls, regrets, mistakes, things we've buried deep. You have to face it head on." The pastor's words sent a shiver down Diddy's spine. He had spent his entire life building walls around his vulnerabilities, hiding his mistakes beneath layers of success and fame. Now, those walls were crumbling, and the thought of exposing what lay beneath terrified him. The cleansing ritual took place the next evening. Pastor Lee, along with 2 other spiritual practitioners, walked through every room of the mansion, reciting prayers and burning sage to banish the lingering darkness. Candles were lit in every corner, their flames flickering as though fighting against an unseen force. At first, the ritual seemed to bring some relief. The oppressive heaviness lifted slightly, and the whispers faded. But as they entered the study, the heart of the disturbance, the air grew icy, and the candle's flames flickered violently. Pastor Lee paused, his face set in grim determination. "This is where it all began," he said, "and this is where it must end." The group formed a circle, hands clasped tightly as they recited a powerful invocation. The air around them grew thicker with each word, and the shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting as though trying to escape the light. Diddy stood in the center of the circle, clutching a cross that Pastor Lee had given him. His heart raced as he felt the weight of countless unseen eyes bearing down on him. Suddenly, the room erupted in chaos. The shadows surged forward, forming a swirling vortex at the center of the circle. A deafening roar filled the room, a sound so primal and otherworldly that it made Diddy's knees buckle. Out of the vortex stepped the figure he had seen before, the man in the tattered suit. "Sean Combs," the figure intoned, its voice layered with an unnatural resonance. "You cannot banish what you refuse to acknowledge. You must see it through." The group's prayers faltered as the figure turned its glowing eyes on Diddy. He felt an overwhelming pull, as though invisible chains were dragging him toward the vortex. Pastor Lee shouted for him to resist, but it was no use. The world around him dissolved once more, and he was plunged into darkness. When the darkness lifted, Diddy found himself standing in a strange liminal space, a vast expanse of shifting colors and shapes that seemed to defy logic. The figure stood before him, its expressionless face now replaced with something far more human, yet disturbingly familiar. "You know who I am," it said, its voice softer now, almost gentle. Diddy stared at the figure, his mind racing. There was something hauntingly familiar about the way it stood, the tilt of its head, the way its eyes seemed to pierce through him. And then it hit him. The figure wasn't a stranger. It was a reflection of himself, or at least a version of him, a younger, more vulnerable version, one that carried all the pain and anger he had spent decades burying. "You're me," Diddy whispered, his voice trembling. "I am," the figure replied. "I am the part of you that you left behind, the part you tried to forget, but no matter how far you ran, I was always with you." The revelation struck Diddy like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just about the box or the key. It was about him, his past, his choices, and the pieces of himself he had abandoned along the way. Tears streamed down his face as he realized the truth. The haunting wasn't external, it was internal, a manifestation of the guilt and regret he had carried for so long. "What do you want from me?" Diddy asked, his voice breaking. "I want you to remember," the figure said, "to face what you've done and who you've become. Only then can you be free." The figure extended its hand, and as Diddy hesitated, the memories flooded back. The people he had wronged, the relationships he had sacrificed, the parts of himself he had lost in the pursuit of greatness. Each memory was a dagger to the heart, but he forced himself to confront them, to feel the pain he had long ignored. As the memories faded, the figure began to dissolve, its form dissipating into the swirling colors around them. "You've taken the first step," it said, its voice fading. "The rest is up to you." Diddy woke in his study, the room bathed in the soft light of dawn. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a calm stillness. Pastor Lee and the others were slumped in chairs around him, exhausted but unharmed. "You did it," Pastor Lee said weakly when he saw Diddy stir. "Whatever it was, you faced it." In the weeks that followed, Diddy began a process of healing. He reached out to old friends and colleagues, mending broken relationships and making amends where he could. He dedicated himself to causes he had once neglected, using his platform to uplift others rather than just himself. The mansion, too, seemed to come alive again, its halls filled with light and laughter once more. The box and key were never found, and Diddy never learned who had sent them or why. But he didn't need to. They had served their purpose, forcing him to confront the truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. And though the experience had left its scars, it also gave him something far more valuable, a chance to start anew, unburdened by the ghosts of his past. Months had passed since the harrowing events that had transformed Sean "Diddy" Combs' life. On the surface, things appeared to have settled. His mansion, once cloaked in an oppressive supernatural weight, was now alive with vibrant energy. Friends visited often, laughter echoed in the halls, and Diddy had returned to his routine with a renewed sense of purpose. Yet, beneath the surface, the scars of that night ran deep. Diddy had taken to journaling, a habit he hadn't indulged in since his early days of hustling for his first big break. His entries were raw, unfiltered glimpses into his psyche, words poured out as he wrestled with the fragments of his past that continued to haunt him. While the oppressive presence in his home was gone, echoes of it lingered in his dreams. Every so often, he would wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as the memory of the swirling vortex and the shadowy figure flooded back to him. He couldn't shake the feeling that, although he had confronted his inner demons, the story wasn't over. One late evening, as he sat in his dimly lit study, a knock echoed through the quiet of the house. It was strange. It was nearly midnight, and he wasn't expecting anyone. His security detail hadn't alerted him, which made the knock all the more unsettling. Diddy approached the door cautiously, his hand resting on the knob. When he opened it, he found nothing but the cold night air and a strange sight at his feet. A small black envelope sealed with crimson wax. A chill ran down his spine as he bent to pick it up. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting it. There was no address, no indication of who had left it. He broke the wax seal, revealing a single piece of parchment inside. The handwriting was familiar, spidery and deliberate, just like the note in the box months ago. It read, "The path isn't finished. Return to the beginning." The cryptic message sent a wave of unease through him. He glanced around the front yard, his eyes scanning for anyone lingering in the shadows. But there was nothing. His mind raced as he closed the door and locked it, retreating to his study with the envelope in hand. Return to the beginning? The words echoed in his mind as he sat at his desk, staring at the note. He knew the message wasn't random. Someone, or something, was orchestrating these events. But why? And what did they mean by the beginning? His thoughts drifted to the box and the key, the cursed artifacts that had set everything in motion. He had buried the memory of them deep, unwilling to dwell on the terror they had unleashed. Yet now it seemed he had no choice but to revisit that dark chapter. Diddy pulled out his phone and began making calls. He contacted experts, historians, occultists, anyone who might shed light on what he had encountered. Days turned into weeks as he poured himself into research, driven by a need to understand. He learned about ancient artifacts said to hold connections to other realms, about keys that could unlock not just physical doors but metaphysical barriers. The box, he discovered, bore symbols tied to obscure myths about truth-bearers, beings that force mortals to confront the deepest truths of their existence. One name kept surfacing during his research: the Keeper of the Veil. Legends described this entity as neither good nor evil, but as a neutral force that existed to maintain balance. Those who summoned it would be forced to confront their pasts, and in doing so, they could either find redemption or be consumed by their own guilt. The key, it seemed, was a tool for summoning the Keeper. Diddy's investigations eventually led him to a reclusive expert in New Orleans, a woman named Eulalie St. Clair. She was known for her deep knowledge of esoteric artifacts and was rumored to have first-hand experience with forces beyond the physical world. Intrigued and desperate for answers, Diddy chartered a private jet and flew to meet her. Eulalie's shop was tucked away in the heart of the French Quarter, a narrow, dimly lit space crammed with shelves of dusty tomes, jars of herbs, and peculiar trinkets. The scent of incense hung heavy in the air, and the faint sound of chanting played from an unseen source. Eulalie herself was an enigmatic figure, a woman in her 60s with piercing eyes that seemed to look straight into Diddy's soul. "So, you're the one who found the box," she said as soon as he stepped inside, her tone making it clear she already knew more than she should. Diddy froze. "How do you—" "It doesn't matter how I know," she interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "What matters is why you're here. Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Diddy recounted the entire ordeal, from the Amazon delivery to the ritual that had seemingly banished the entity. Eulalie listened intently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "You were marked," she said finally. "The moment you opened that box, you became part of a chain of events far older than you can imagine. The Keeper of the Veil chose you." "Chose me for what?" Diddy asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "I didn't ask for any of this." "Few do," Eulalie replied. "But the Keeper doesn't choose randomly. It finds those who are at a crossroads, those whose lives carry a ripple effect far beyond themselves. You've faced part of the truth, but there's more to uncover. The question is, are you willing to see it through?" Diddy hesitated. He thought about the message in the black envelope, about the sense of unfinished business that had plagued him since that night. He didn't want to go deeper into the darkness, but he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice steady. Eulalie smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "You need to return to the box, to the key. They're the only way to complete the journey." Eulalie helped Diddy retrace his steps, using her knowledge and resources to uncover the whereabouts of the artifacts. Through her network of contacts, she tracked the box and key to an underground auction house in New York, where they had somehow resurfaced. Together, they devised a plan to retrieve them, though Eulalie warned him that once the items were in his possession again, there would be no turning back. The auction house was a shadowy affair held in a dimly lit basement beneath an unmarked building in the city's financial district. The room buzzed with tension as wealthy collectors and eccentric buyers bid on rare and unusual items. When the box and key appeared on the auction block, Diddy felt a chill run down his spine. Even from a distance, their presence was palpable, as though the room itself recoiled from them. Diddy had prepared for this moment, bringing enough cash to outbid anyone. But the process wasn't easy. Other bidders seemed inexplicably drawn to the items, their hands shooting up instinctively as if compelled by an unseen force. The price climbed higher and higher, until finally, with one last bid, Diddy secured the box and key. As he held the items in his hands once more, he felt the familiar surge of energy coursing through him. The connection was immediate, undeniable. He could feel the weight of the Keeper's gaze, even though the room around him remained unchanged. Eulalie, who had accompanied him to the auction, placed a hand on his shoulder. "The final step is yours alone," she said. "Take the box somewhere meaningful, somewhere tied to your beginning. The Keeper will do the rest." Diddy knew exactly where he needed to go. The journey took him back to Harlem, to the modest apartment building where he had grown up. The neighborhood had changed over the years, but the memories it held were as vivid as ever. This was where his dreams had taken root, where he had first tasted the bitterness of loss and the sweetness of ambition. He stood outside the building for a long time, clutching the box and key. The air was heavy with anticipation, and he could feel the Keeper's presence growing stronger with every passing moment. Finally, he stepped inside, making his way to the roof. The place where he had spent countless nights as a teenager, staring up at the stars and dreaming of a better life. As he placed the box on the ground and inserted the key, the world around him seemed to hold its breath. The lock clicked, and the familiar black fog began to seep out, enveloping him in its cold embrace. This time, Diddy didn't resist. He let the fog consume him, surrendering to whatever truth awaited. When the fog cleared, he found himself standing in a vast, empty void. The keeper was there, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "You have returned," it said. "Are you ready to see it through?" Diddy nodded, his voice steady. "I'm ready." The keeper extended a hand and the void around them shifted, transforming into a series of vivid scenes. Moments from Diddy's past that he had long forgotten or suppressed. But this time, the visions didn't just show his mistakes. They showed the impact of his choices on others. The lives he had touched, for better or worse. The keeper did not speak, but its presence was palpable, urging him to absorb the lessons laid bare before him. For the first time, Diddy truly understood the depth of his influence. Not just as an artist or mogul, but as a human being navigating a world of fragile connections. These moments, both good and bad, painted a complex picture of a man who had been shaped as much by his triumphs as by his failings. Then came the most searing memory of all. He was a young boy again, sitting in his childhood living room, clutching his mother's hand as the news of his father's death shattered their world. That single event, the pain of loss and the weight of suddenly becoming the man of the house, had set the course of his life in motion. It was in that moment that ambition had taken root, a relentless drive to protect and provide, born from the fear of being vulnerable. Diddy felt a lump rise in his throat as he relived the memory, the rawness of it stripping away the armor he had built over decades. The keeper stood silently as Diddy knelt, tears streaming down his face. He wasn't just mourning his father's loss, he was mourning the parts of himself that had been buried in its wake. The child who had been forced to grow up too soon, the man who had learned to equate success with self-worth. "You have seen," it said, "and you have accepted. The truth is neither your enemy nor your salvation, it is simply yours. What you choose to do with it will define the path ahead." The void dissolved, and Diddy found himself back on the roof of his childhood building. The air was crisp, the city alive with the hum of distant traffic and the chatter of life below. The box and key lay before him, but they were no longer shrouded in darkness. Instead, they radiated a gentle, golden light, a sign perhaps that the burden they carried had been lifted. Diddy stood, the weight on his shoulders replaced by a profound sense of clarity. He had been given a second chance, not just to live, but to live authentically, to embrace both his flaws and his strengths. As he descended the building's staircase, he felt a quiet determination take hold. The ghosts of his past would no longer define him. They would guide him, serving as reminders of where he had been and where he could go. In the days that followed, Diddy made good on this promise. He launched initiatives to support underserved communities, invested in mental health resources for young creatives, and became a vocal advocate for forgiveness of others and oneself. Though the events that had brought him to this point remained a mystery, he no longer sought to unravel them. Some doors, he realized, were meant to remain closed. As Diddy navigated this new chapter of his life, the transformation in him was palpable. It was as if the events that had once threatened to consume him had instead reshaped him from within. He moved with a sense of calm confidence, no longer driven by the frenetic, often reckless energy of his earlier years. The drive to prove himself had been replaced with a deeper understanding of his true purpose, and his actions began to reflect that. His relationships, too, underwent a quiet but significant shift. Diddy had always been surrounded by people, friends, colleagues, and family, but now there was a deeper intimacy to his connections. He reached out to those he had previously kept at arm's length, extending olive branches to old friends and rekindling relationships that had long been neglected. It wasn't about public appearances anymore or maintaining the image of the mogul. It was about making things right, about healing wounds that had festered for far too long. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the mysterious delivery to Diddy's mansion? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.